field of technology. Professor Dawson had an stellar career in academia so far. He's had his BS, bachelor's degree in mechanical and mathematical sciences from Monash University, Australia, and then he moved to US to pursue graduate studies in mechanical and aerospace engineering in Princeton University. Then he worked as a postdoctoral scholar in California Institute of Technology, it's known as Caltech. His research focus is in fluid dynamics in general, but in particular, the unsteady flows of, sorry if I am not really explaining it very well.
No, you're doing great.
But it's about unsteady flows in fluids. Essentially, think about when you're flying, you are flying in an airplane safely. This because of the culminative research done by researchers like Professor Dawson. His approach is both classical and more or less data-driven, I would say, the way I understand. So he's about modeling these efficient numerical models for, again, modeling these flows. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Dawson to tell us what's the latest in this area.
Well, thanks, Suru, for the generous introduction and for the invitation to come and talk to you all here. So I'm going to be talking about a few different research projects that I've been working on over the past few years that all kind of fit under this sort of general title of Methods for Reduced Complexity Modeling in Fluids. And in this talk, I'm going to be focusing less on the specific applications and more on the sort of the general ideas that have driven these research projects. So to give a bit more context about what my research involves, again, my main application is in fluid dynamics and aerodynamics, but more generally, if we have some system that we wish to study, there's typically a bunch of places where we can get information about that system. So in most engineering systems, we know what the governing equations are because you know, we know what the physics is telling us. And from there, these days, we can generate more and more data. So the sorts of things that I'm interested in, questions that I'm interested in asking, revolve around how can we best utilize everything that we know about a system. So the equations that we start with, the data that we can get from computations or experiments, along with whatever insight that comes with the study of those two things, to come up with models for our system that are more tractable than the exact system. And so what I mean by that is low-dimensional models that perhaps can be used to generate much more data, which is going to be an approximation, but which maybe can tell us more about our system. We can get low-dimensional equations that we might be able to use for to gain more insight into our system, and also can be used for prediction and control. So that's sort of roughly speaking where I sort of stand in what drives my research. Getting a little bit more specific, though, in fluid dynamics and indeed in many other areas of research, we can now generate almost as much data as we want, or at least much more data than we could previously. And that situation that we find ourselves in leads to a number of interesting questions or sort of new research problems that are worth addressing and are sort of somewhat more abstract. So again, I'm interested in asking questions related to how we can best use the data that we can generate to do useful things. So to understand our system, to predict what our system will do in the future, to control our system. And then there are ways to sort of extend that sort of analysis to ask how sure can we be about our analysis as a function of sort of what we might know about the robustness or quality of our data. And then also, how can we combine data with everything else we know about the system? And so what I'm going to be talking about today are sort of a number of projects that address some of these questions. But before I get started on the specifics, I want to sort of orient us with looking at a very simple example or a very simple place to start if we're looking to try to simplify or decompose a potentially complex system into simpler components. So what we can do is if we have a time-varying system, perhaps we're measuring the velocity of a fluid, which is what I'm calling U here, but it really could be any engineering or otherwise system of interest. A natural place to start might be to do what you often do when you try to solve a PDE is you separate the variables. So you try to approximate your system by some spatial modes, each of which is associated by some temporal coefficient. And so the picture here might be, here we have a visualization of turbulent flow over a surface, so a turbulent boundary layer, and which might be difficult to study in its entirety, but if we can start to pull it apart and identify the different structures that might be present at different length and time scales, then perhaps we have a hope of really understanding the root cause of the dynamics and structures and phenomena that we observe. So where could we get such a decomposition? So again, there are a few places where we could start. We could start with the governing equations themselves. Maybe we have a set of nonlinear PDEs that we can linearize and then find eigenfunctions of. Or we could forget that knowledge and just use data. And I'm going to be looking at projects where we do one or both of these things in this talk. But let's focus to start with just on data-driven decompositions. And so given a set of data, there are sort of a number of criteria that we might use to drive how we wish to decompose our data or decompose our system. So again, we have an infinite choice of possible basis functions, if you like, for our system. But ideally, we might like a decomposition that's efficient. So that is, we can closely approximate our true system, or at least the data that we generate from that system, using a relatively small number of modes. It can also be convenient to have an orthogonal basis. So we might wish for our, say, our spatial functions to be orthogonal to each other. We also might want to be able to say something physically about what our functions represent. So perhaps we want to decompose our system in such a way where every spatial mode is associated with one temporal eigenvalue or one growth, decay, or oscillation rate. It turns out that if we do this, prioritizing these first 2 points is something that in fluids is called proper orthogonal decomposition, but really it's just taking a singular value decomposition of your data. So very similar to principal component analysis, and has a bunch of other names in different fields as well. Alternatively, if we focus on isolating different dynamical features, then one way to do this, at least in fluids, is do something by the name of dynamic mode decomposition. And again, the terminology is perhaps less important than the motivating idea, which is that somehow we want to, decompose our system in a sensible way. Okay, so what am I going to talk about in this presentation? So there'll be 3 projects that I want to touch on. And depending on how we're going for time, I might cut a little bit out of the last one. The first project that I'm going to be looking at is some work that I actually did in grad school, trying to understand what happens if our data is noisy and how that can propagate through the sort of analysis techniques that I was talking about previously. And I'll talk more about the other projects when we get to them. And this was work with Maziar Hamati, Matt Williams, who were both postdocs with my advisor, Clancy Rowley, at the time. So I mentioned dynamic mode decomposition, and I'll say a little bit more about what it means algorithmically in a couple of slides. But in the process of using it, we observed something that others had observed as well, which is that it seemed to be quite sensitive to noisy data. And in particular, it was sensitive to sensor noise. So this is noise which doesn't interact with the true state of your system, which I'm now calling X, but is sort of a function of having imperfect measurements. And so what I'm going to do is, and again, I'm not going to go into too much detail through all of the math, but trying to see how we can pick apart and analyze how noise should be expected to influence the outputs of this particular modal decomposition algorithm. Okay, so we're going to start with a really simple example. So we'll start with a linear system, and a linear system that's very low dimensional. So this guy here. So what we can do is evolve this system in time, collect data at particular time increments, add noise to our results, and we can sort of doing things in an idealized way here. So we're adding noise whose characteristics we know exactly. And then we can use this algorithm, dynamic mode decomposition, to try to identify the eigenvalue that we were originally identifying, or the eigenvalue that we expect to see, which is just an eigenvalue of this 2x2 matrix. Turns out that when we do that, we get the wrong answer. But we get the wrong answer not just because we have some scatter in our noise due to the fact that our data is noisy, but we actually have this bias. So what I'm showing here is a scatter plot of the results of applying this algorithm to noisy data for 1,000 different realizations of noise. And we see that even if we take the mean of all of those realizations, we're nowhere near the true answer, which is surprising, perhaps, for what is a very simple system, and also particularly concerning if you're looking to use this algorithm for more complex systems where you don't know what the correct answer is. So we wanted to understand why this is the case. So to skip over some details, the idea behind the algorithm is we're trying to find some linear propagator that maps our system one time step into the future. And there are a number of ways that this can be done. But the way that DMD was doing this, or is doing this in the most simple form, is that we just, we basically use a pseudo-inverse of one of our data matrices and multiply it by the other one, which gives us some sort of least squares fit. And that's, again, perhaps what one might think to be a sensible thing to do. Again, don't worry too much about the mathematical details. But what we're going to do now is suppose that the actual data that we have consists of our true data plus some noise. And again, later on we can make certain assumptions about what the characteristics of that noise are. But for now, we can just assume that we can assemble that into some matrix. So here what we're doing, to go back a step, our X is a matrix consisting of all of our measurements where each measurement at a given time is assembled as a column in the matrix. So we sort of have space in the vertical direction and time in the horizontal direction. And again, we expect for noise to influence our results. But what we might want to hope is that at least the expected value of what we're looking for when we apply this algorithm to noisy data matches what we would get if we had true data. And it turns out, though, if you compute what this expectation is and go through the math and make a bunch of assumptions about the noise, again I'm not going to go, the details aren't too difficult. It just involves some linear algebra and eliminating higher order terms and so forth. We end up actually finding that our expected value is not the true propagation matrix that we expect to identify, but is actually biased. But moreover, what we can show is that if we know the characteristics of the noise, So that is, if we know what its variance is, which is this sigma n, then we know exactly what this bias is. So that's good and bad. It's bad that this algorithm is biased to noise, but it's good that we at least know what that bias is. And the nice thing is that now we can correct for it. So if we know what the bias is, we can sort of pull it to the other side of this equation and sort of add this bias correction term to the results of applying this algorithm to noisy data. And lo and behold, we find that we get rid of at least the bias component in our error. So again, I'm sort of talking about this for one particular algorithm that I've simplified a little bit for the sake of a presentation here. But I think that the bigger picture is a little more general, which is that if you're looking to do something with your data, it's important to understand how any noise or uncertainty in your data affects the results of the algorithm that you're looking to apply. It turns out that directly correcting for this bias is one of a number of alternative formulations that we came up with to construct bias-free approximations. Turns out that you can kind of identify a model for your system forward and backward in time and take the geometric average of the results. That's bias-free. It turns out that you can, well, basically extend the least squares fitting approach that's really at the heart of what we're doing here to a total least squares algorithm, which really means that we're taking into account error on both sides of the equation to come up with a bias-free alternative or extension to this particular algorithm. And it turns out at the end of the day that all of these things eliminate the bias. So what I'm showing here is not the individual realizations, but the 95% confidence intervals of each of our realizations. And it turns out that we can also improve the scatter in our results also for this simple example. But that's really all that we've looked at so far. It's a very simple, linear, two-dimensional system, which is maybe not a realistic sort of representative of the types of systems that we might be actually encountering in practice. So what we can also look at is start to add a little more complexity. So we can start to look at how, well, we can, one, start to study these things more systematically. So what I'm looking at here is the same simple linear system, but looking at how the error between our true and our predicted model varies as a function of noise level and the amount of data that we have. And it turns out that what we were seeing previously really amounts to a saturation in accuracy that you get as you add more and more data to your collection. And this is important to understand, I think, because naively one might expect that one way to get around having noisy data is just add more data. I mean, that works if you're trying to find a mean or a variance or something, or a mean or something like that. But it turns out for this algorithm, it doesn't work. However, if we apply our bias-free alternatives, then we kind of recover this 1 on the square root of the amount of data that you have, sort of law of large numbers decay that we can sort of expect to have. And this all collapses nicely following arguments that are relatively easy to make. That's all well and good. Again, so far I'm only looking at relatively a very simple system. So what we're going to look at now is actual experimental data that we get from a fluid simulation. It's still a relatively simple system. So we have flow going over this bluff body. It's just a cylinder. And typical of a system like this is you see this alternating vortex shedding of vortices in the wake. So what we can do is, again, try to apply our dynamic mode decomposition algorithm to this data. And it turns out we get different results depending on whether we use the standard dynamic mode decomposition as it was originally formulated, or one of our noise-free variants. Now here we don't know the true answer, but we do know that the dynamics that we see here are largely periodic, so we expect to have eigenvalues that are more or less marginally stable, which is what we do get with our noise-robust variant, but not with the original algorithm. And if we want to show that our alternative proposed method is better, we can also then use this model to predict the evolution of our system from some amount of test data, and we can show, again, that our improved algorithm doesn't have this artificial decay that you can get, or that can become apparent if you're not careful about dealing with noisy data. And I'll mention here that in this case, we no longer have nice, clean, uncorrelated Gaussian noise. This is noise that comes about from a variety of sources relative to, arising from limits in spatial resolution and how we're collecting and processing the data from an experiment. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll skip over this example, but basically we can also characterize how process noise, so that is noise that actually is within your system and affects the state of your system, is also influenced, and then look at trying to tease apart the contributions of each. But again, the big picture that I want to emphasize here is, regardless of the specifics of the algorithm, that it's important when you're using data-driven modeling methods to understand what the quality of your data is, both in terms of perhaps noise, but also spatial resolution and temporal resolution and things of this nature, and to understand how that then propagates through whatever method you're trying to apply. Okay, I will mention one other piece of work, which I'm not going to have time to talk about too much, but just to tie things back with what I was talking about in the first couple of slides, where I was talking about using both data and knowledge of the governing equations to perhaps understand something about our system, or in this case, to identify structures or decompositions of our system. And it turns out we're also looking into ideas that can allow us to add constraints to our primarily data-driven method to ensure that whatever output we get has to be consistent with other things that we might know about the dynamics of our system. And again, I'll skip over the details. Okay, so now we're going to change course a little bit. And what I want to talk about is now more of a method of equation-based analysis. So we're not going to start out, at least, we're not going to use data. But I'm going to be looking at a computational approach that we believe, or we can show, speeds up some of this analysis. So the context that we're looking at here is non-normal systems, and particularly non-normal linear systems, where you might, so you can just think about this as a set of ODEs that are evolving in time and are stable. So eventually you might you will eventually reach some equilibrium solution. However, if your underlying operator, so your A matrix, if you've looked at dynamics and controls, is non-normal, then what you can see is that your system can amplify or can grow in energy in time before ultimately decaying. And the reason for this, it comes down to having eigenvectors that are not orthogonal. So you might have two decaying eigenvectors, the components, each of which are decaying over time, but whose sum grows before it decays. And this isn't this goes beyond a simple toy problem, because it turns out in fluids, there are many cases where asymptotically, from a linear analysis, we predict that systems should be stable. So if you look at flow through a pipe, for example, then it's conjectured that at any Reynolds number, so no matter how fast your fluid is flowing, the system is asymptotically stable. So it has only eigenvectors in the left half plane. However, in practice, beyond a certain flow speed, we find that we get turbulent flow, which for a while was a contradiction and is still a phenomena which is much studied. But it turns out that at the heart of this is the fact that the linearized operator is highly non-normal and indeed exhibits a large amount of energy growth before eventually decaying. And such energy growth can then trigger nonlinear effects that can eventually lead to turbulence. Again, I'm not going to wade too much into the flow physics other than that explanation to sort of say that these types of analyses are important to understand, for example, how we go between smooth laminar fluid flow and turbulent flow. Now, how do we do this sort of analysis qualitatively? At the end of the day, what we end up looking at is looking at this finite time propagation operator and taking its singular value decomposition and looking at its leading singular values and vectors. Again, don't worry too much about the details. I'll try more to focus on the big picture here. But if I want to find, for example, the worst case initial condition that's going to grow the most in time after some specified time, which I call tau here, then I get that from the leading singular left and right singular vectors from the SVD of this operator. So it's very easy to formulate this problem. Computing it, however, can be tricky for a number of reasons. Often, if we're looking at a complex fluid flow, which we've discretized, this A matrix can be prohibitively large. It can be so large that we never actually formulate it. So we can only really look at certain pieces of it at a time. So in order to perform this analysis, again, if we can directly form and decompose our matrix. But oftentimes, we have to get at the answer a more indirect way. So by taking some numerical code that we have and stepping it forward in time, stepping the system and the adjoint system forward and backward in time in order to converge to our answer, which is something that we can do but can be computationally quite prohibitive. Or to put things sort of schematically, how an algorithm of this nature works, we might start with some random initial condition, go forward a certain amount in time, we apply our adjoint system, that same amount of time sort of backwards, and then we sort of have to repeat this process enough times until we converge to the correct answer. Which again, we can do. It just often can take a lot of computational resources to do so. And we often don't have any good guidance as to how long we need to repeat this process until we get to the right answer. The other big point, though, is that if we're looking at the amount of growth that our system can have over a given time horizon, and then we want to look at another time horizon, we actually need to basically start from scratch with this process. So what this means is that we have very limited reusability of our data across different time horizons. And also this method, due to its iterative nature, is relatively difficult to parallelize. But this is still sort of standard practice in the field. What I'm going to propose, or what we've been looking at as an alternative to this, is to take advantage of some recent, or relatively recent, sort of in the last 10 or so years, developments in random projection methods. So that is, rather than applying an iteration loop, we say we only want to do things once, but the flip side is we want to start with many different initial conditions, propagate those through our system once, and then, apply our adjoint operator to get our answer. And it turns out that the formulation of this problem is sort of a natural application of some of these random projection methods that can be used to approximate the action or the properties of our linear operator A. So roughly speaking, the way that this works is we start with some random initial conditions, we run all of those through our system and get the answer. Then we find an orthogonal basis for all of our answers, and it turns out that that is actually a reasonably good approximation for, well, for sort of identifying what the dominant amplification mechanisms in our operator are, or what the dominant principal components of our operator are. However, we can do one better. So we can also look at sort of making this approach even more parallel, where we start with different random conditions both for our forward and our adjoint system, and achieve our answer, come up with an answer without ever having to sort of add an extra step at each different time horizon. So the nice thing about this approach is that you're never waiting for another step to finish before you need to go on to the next step. So the idea here is that we still might have to do a lot of computations, but if we have access to, say, many cores on a cluster, it's very easy to run all of these random initial conditions through our system at once, wait for them all to stop, and then get our answer, rather than having to do one, then doing another one, and then keeping on going through the loop. So at the end of the day, aside from the advantage in parallelizability, what we also get for free is that we can use the same data for all of our different time horizons. Because the nice thing is we're starting from a random initial condition for all of them, so it doesn't really matter what time horizon we're looking at. So the takeaway here is that these randomized methods become very highly parallelizable and are particularly suited for this type of analysis where we need to study not just one linear operator, but a whole family of linear operators that are parameterized, in this case, by our time horizon. And then I can show some results. So what we're looking at here is flow over, well, what's known as a backwards-facing step. So we have flow through a channel, and then all of a sudden the channel gets wider. And so if I ask what is the worst case initial condition that gives rise to the largest growth in energy, from standard methods, we get something that looks like this. Using our randomized method, we get essentially the same answer. So this is our sort of initial condition which amplifies in energy the most over 60 units in time. And after 60 units in time, it looks something like this. So we've convected downstream. And we can look at suboptimal modes as well, and it works. We can see how our method converges as a function of the number of random initial conditions that we look at. It turns out that it's actually surprisingly well behaved. We only need a handful of different random initial conditions in order to converge to the true answer. So this is looking at the amount of energy growth that we see as a function of time horizon for our system. And our single pass algorithm, which is sort of has more parallelizability and more data reusability, also converges, but at a slower rate. So anyway, I went through some of these details relatively quickly, but the idea here is that we're using these randomized methods to make this class of analysis more efficient and more parallelizable. And so I think that there are sort of a lot more applications that these ideas can be used in. So the last thing I want to talk about quickly is actually sort of a bit of a change of pace again. So we're also going to be looking at equation-based analyses. We're again going to be looking at identifying mode shapes. So you can again think back to that separation of variables that I showed originally. And what we were interested in doing here is actually throwing out the numerics altogether and going back to sort of classic pen and paper studies to see, or analysis, to see whether we could say something about our result before we actually go through the potentially computationally expensive procedure. So again, to reorient us, here, well, now our motivation really is looking at turbulent flows. So we'll be looking at some examples of a turbulent boundary layer. And the idea here is that just from the governing equations, what I want to be able to do is predict what structures are going to be most present at given length and time scales. So that's sort of the big picture of what we're doing. But more generally, what motivates this analysis is as follows. So in fluids, we might start with a system that is actually quite simple. So maybe we have flow over a flat surface. Maybe we have flow over a different shaped solid body. So in this case, just a cylinder, so like I was showing previously. But in any case, it's relatively simple to describe. And of course, you can look at more complex geometries and so forth, but it typically doesn't require too many degrees of freedom to at least describe the system. However, to do an analysis, typically what we do is we discretize our system. And then all of a sudden, what started with at least a phenomenologically simple system becomes numerically quite a complex system, or a system that potentially requires some computational effort to start to pick apart. But then if we look at the answers that we get, particularly when we're looking at these sort of modal decompositions or reduced complexity modeling, almost by design, the outputs that we get, again, are quite simple because, well, we want them to be. And so it almost seems a shame that we have to go through this computationally complex step to go from A to B, or to go from the relatively simple system to describe to the relatively simple outputs that we get when we ask the question, what do we expect to see when we run our computationally complex analysis? Or in other words, if we look at typical workflow in terms of complexity, we have this sort of rate limiting hump that limits how much analysis we can do, or how many parameters we can vary. So we're going to ask the question, can we bypass this computational complexity? And as I sort of alluded to, if we could do this, we'd reduce the computational bottleneck that arises because of the fact that we need to allocate some serious computational power towards analyzing our discretized system, which can limit the number of parameters that we can look at, or the number of different test cases that we can run. I'm going to skip over the mathematical details a little bit here, but the idea is we have a nonlinear system. Again, we're writing it in such a way that we can say something about the system from a decomposition of a linear operator, which is the associated resolvent operator to the linearized dynamics. Again, the mathematical specifics don't matter too much. Again, we're taking a singular value decomposition. It's one of the most useful things that you can know about, I think, in my line of research and probably many others, is knowing all of the properties of decompositions of linear operators generally, but I think the SVD is nice because any linear operator always has an SVD, which is nice. And again, I'm going to skip through some of the specifics. We can do some math, but at the end of the day, the types of modes that we identify actually look super simple. If we look at their absolute value, they basically look like a hump that's centered about a particular location, and we can predict what this location is, sort of the location where our wave speed matches the mean velocity of our fluid. And we seem to have this symmetric distribution about there. And it turns out that there's some theory that suggests that these modes should be able to be modeled, at least for this simple system, by a relatively simple template. And this is sort of the simplest case of this type of analysis. We can extend it a little bit further, but the idea here is that if I can write down sort of an analytic template form for what I expect my mode to look like, what I expect my spatial structure to look like, then I can actually continue through my analysis, apply my linearized operator analytically rather than doing a discretization, come up with a cost function that I need to minimize that's sort of equivalent of taking a singular value decomposition, and then use that to identify the free parameters in my template. And then we can do a bunch more math, but at the end of the day, what we find is that this analytic approach actually does a really good job of predicting the relevant parameters. So we can predict this A, which is sort of the phase variation. We can predict the width of our mode, which is B, and we can predict the amount of amplification that we expect to see for that particular mode. And again, we can sweep through many parameters, but the point, or one of the advantages here, aside from the fact that it's nice to do things analytically, is that rather than having to do things numerically, this is still a relatively simple system that I'm looking at, but for all of the data that's on this plot, the numerical results, took on the order of several minutes or several tens of minutes to compute, whereas analytic, it's almost immediate because we no longer have to do a numerical discretization. We're optimizing over almost a trivially small parameter space, which is really, really fast to do. And again, if I'm comparing my true modes so that I get from my brute force numerical decomposition of my operator to my estimated modes just from using analytic methods, they're almost identical. So this is nice for a number of reasons. Aside from being computationally much more efficient, I think it's kind of nice because it sheds some insight as to what theory is actually driving the emergence of these structures when you do look at the full system again. And we can vary many parameters, and it all tends to work. We can do other things like looking at the implementation of boundary conditions. We sort of do this by incorporating image modes that cancel out, that enforce the right boundary conditions and so forth. Again, I've skipped over the details, but hopefully I've given some flavor of this analysis, which is sort of at the opposite end of the spectrum to where I started, where you study a system by generating a lot of data. Here we have no data. We also don't even do any really any numerics at all. So we're developing an analytic alternative to what otherwise would be relatively computationally expensive decompositions. So those are the three pieces of research that I wanted to talk about. I got done with this presentation and realized I hadn't actually talked about many of the applications that I look at. So I thought I'd show one video, which is sort of in aerodynamics. And what we're trying to do here is using feedback control to determine how our airfoil should move in order to achieve a desired lift coefficient over time, which is somewhat arbitrary, but shows that our control system is working effectively. So with that, I'll thank you for your time. I'll thank all of my various advisors and collaborators on a lot of this work. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Well, before asking the speakers any questions, so I thought that was a great presentation to show you how different areas of research can give you a lot of insights to solve your research problem. For example, maybe robotics related kinematics problems or AI related problems. I mean, if you notice, it's essentially very high dimensional systems, and Professor Dawson used some of the same things we're using, but in a different context. So that's what I thought of inviting Dr. Dawson here to give us what are the other things they are doing, maybe like similar but looks different. So yeah, so now the floor is open for your questions.
Well, in DMD, I could not follow up. In DMD of noise data, the eigenvalue never went to the right-hand side.
Yeah.
So does that mean you considered only laminar flow?
So not necessarily laminar, but if you're at some limit cycle or at some sort of fully developed state such that your system is no longer, in a mean sense, evolving with time, then you kind of expect to find these eigenvalues that are marginally stable, in some sense. If you look at smaller windows in time, then you'll get things that are growing and decaying, which is interesting. But if you, personally, I think that there are limitations to, let's say you had turbulent flow, which is unstable, but if you take a lot of data and try to identify, sort of deterministic eigenvalues for a chaotic system, sort of the best thing you end up doing, or the best thing you can really hope for, is that you sort of attract onto the unit circle or into the line of marginal stability. But yeah, it's an interesting question. But that's sort of why that's the case. Of course, as I mentioned before, there are other things that you can do. So if you look at smaller time windows, or if you look at a system that's going unstable from its unstable equilibrium towards a turbulent state, then you would get growing unstable eigenvalues. But it kind of depends on exactly what you're looking at in terms of the data.
So my question is about the first part of the presentation.
Yeah.
Could you a little bit elaborate on the experiments?
Yes.
How you measured the variables?
Yeah.
What was the environment? What was the interfering variables? Or how did you collect the data?
Yeah,
how
sure.
Did you apply the noise? And all of
Yeah.
that?
So thanks for bringing that up, because I really did skip over this. And the first thing to note is that I didn't personally collect this data. I've done a very limited number of experiments in my time. I'm more on the other side of things. But how this data was collected is it's in a water channel. So you have water flowing over this body. And what you do is you put tiny particles in your water that you assume they're neutrally buoyant. You assume that they're a low enough concentration so they don't affect the flow itself. But they reflect light. Then what you do is you shine a laser sheet onto your particles and basically take a photo. You then go forward a tiny bit in time and repeat the process. So you have these two images of where a bunch of particles are separated by a very small time window. Then you can do some correlation analysis to work out what your velocity field must be to advect those particles, that amount in a certain time. So no different to what you would do classically, except you're looking at many, many particles. And then from there, you use that to get your velocity field. So really, every sort of snapshot in this video actually comes sort of from two raw photos that you look at the difference of to determine the velocity field. And so that's a fairly standard technique in fluids, experimental fluids, to determine velocity and other quantities. This is actually vorticity that we're looking at, but that's just the curl of velocity, so it comes from the same place. But you'll see that it's not perfect. And again, you're limited you're limited in terms of the spatial resolution and temporal resolution and noise that comes into play in every sort of part of that process. But yeah, it's a good question.
So is this actual photographs or is it simulated data?
So this is from an experiment.
Okay.
It's not really photographs because the raw photos have been processed in a lot of different ways to get that. But yeah, it's from experimental data.
So if you're applying your algorithm where you do the bias correction to something like this, what's the error that's involved in doing the bias correction from the actual result?
That's a great question. So actually, there are ways that you can try to estimate it just from either your knowledge of the system or from, well, perhaps you could take the data where you don't expect anything to change and look at what the sensor noise is. But what I'm actually using here is a version of the algorithm that doesn't need the noise characteristics. So I guess the first formulation that I showed, had that correction term that explicitly needs the variance. Here I'm using a formulation that you can show is bias-free regardless, without an explicit correction.
Looks a bit in the picture like the bias-free data points are just original data points with the real part suppressed. Is that true, or is it accidental?
I think that in this case, that is very close to being the case. There are some extra eigenvalues that sort of come up, but more or less that's what's going on. And I think for systems that are where the eigenvectors are almost orthogonal to each other, you expect to see that. And the reason actually is because of the bias term that we get here is it's a diagonal matrix. So roughly speaking, and I think you can show that this is the case if A is Hermitian, that all of the eigenvalues will shift by an amount that's proportional to this term. But I don't think you can make a claim in general because, well, if you add a diagonal matrix to a non-normal matrix, then I think you can mess up the eigenvalues quite a bit. But yeah, that's a good observation, and in that case, that is pretty much what's going on.
Any other question? I have another question,
Yeah, sure.
right? So the students in the School of Computing deals with a lot of, let's say, data. You could see maybe experiments done on humans, like a lot of survey data. Essentially, you are thinking like high-dimensional system. Can you see any correlation between the two? I mean, the techniques that you are using, and if you can elaborate on the possibility of doing that.
Yeah, sure. So, I guess the caveat here is that a lot of the techniques that I'm looking at here are assuming that we at least have quantitative data, so numerical data, or data that can be made quantitative. So assuming that we have that limitation, then I think a lot of these techniques can and have been extended to many other systems. So for example, if I go back to a decomposition like this, if you're measuring properties assigned to different people, then you can also, your X could become person number, and you're still maybe looking at how something evolves in time. So there's no reason why you couldn't do basically the same thing again. And really, this first method that I'm talking about is essentially the same as principal component analysis, which, at least in my experience, is commonly used to try to decompose a potentially high-dimensional data set, regardless of what it is, into dominant principal directions. But also, particularly if you have time-evolving data, then I think that these methods, so like dynamic mode decomposition, that try to identify dynamics for the system can also be used. And again, there are very similar methods in other fields that are sometimes called different things, but are more or less the same thing. But yes, I definitely think that it's possible that there are many applications of these types of ideas, particularly the data-driven stuff where you don't need equations, right? So a lot of the things that I'm looking at, it's kind of nice because we have a lot of data, but we also sort of have the safety blanket of knowing what the governing equations are, so we can pick ourselves up if something isn't consistent with that. Like when you're making measurements in the real world where we don't have these underlying equations from physics, it can be trickier, but some of these data-driven methods perhaps can be particularly useful there because that's really perhaps all that we have.
I mean, one of the reasons, one of the things that could happen when you have a lot of data, and then basically you kind of lose the bigger picture sometimes because you think, okay, I can use machine learning. Right, so I think perhaps maybe a little more analytical approach to see what are the governing properties beforehand. Applying machine learning could be of great help, as Professor Dawson's research showed you that numerical techniques can take like tens of minutes, whereas if you did something analytical and try to find something to simplify your system could be helpful. You could do it in a fraction of a second.
Yeah. No, I think that that's a very insightful statement and perhaps philosophy in that the more complex or the more involved the method is that you want to use, I think in some ways the more you have to justify the need to use that method as opposed to perhaps something similar. Or you want to perhaps show that the simplest thing doesn't work before you add complexity to your analysis.
So if you don't have any questions, let's thank Professor Dawson again for the wonderful talk.